All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to your favorite anatomy class and your favorite anatomy teacher. So I'm on a little early this morning, um, but I just graded your quizzes. I just sent them back. Not bad. If you want corrections, send them in. Make sure you get your other stuff done, review sheets and all that kind of stuff. I need to see that. If you weren't there for the um, review, there's only like 4 people on there. So anyway, let me make sure we got here. Yeah, I probably won't catch many people here today. All right, so now we're going to get into, we did the anatomy portion of the lungs for the most part, and now we're going to get into the physiology portion. All right, so, like we discussed way back in the first couple of days, the anatomy and the structures, it is what it is. All right, you just memorize them, you know them, you learn them. That's what it is. Okay, and it's pretty straightforward, and it can be kind of like a vocabulary test, to be honest with you. But now, as we get into the next part of this, the physiology, it's kind of like the heart. We need to know why it's doing it and how it's doing it and all that kind of stuff. And so now we're getting into this respiratory physiology. So you really need to be able to understand what it is. Okay, you need to understand how this works and why it works and what's going on. Okay, if you can't explain it, then you don't know it. All right. So respiratory physiology. Okay. So here we're kind of talking about that pulmonary circuit here. All right. That goes back to the heart, right? The right side of the heart. It's dealing with the deoxygenated blood. It's going from the right side of the heart to the lungs to be oxygenated, and then it's going to leave the lungs and go back to the left side of the heart. So when we take that deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart and we take it to the left side and then we send it to the lungs, what is happening in those lungs and all that to take that deoxygenated blood full of carbon dioxide, get the carbon dioxide into the lung airspace, get the oxygen out of the airspace into the blood, and make that exchange to where oxygen then is carried throughout the body to the tissues and carbon dioxide is exhaled. Oh, goodness. So, here we are at this physiology portion, okay? Now, when we look at this can be broken down into 4 different events, all right? So, the ventilation the ventilation part of it is just air moving in and out of you, okay? So, there's that event where air goes in, air goes out. All right. There's this external respiration where there is a gas exchange between the blood and the alveoli. Okay. So we have this gas exchange between the blood vessels that are wrapped around those paper thin alveoli. Okay. We have respiratory gas transport. Okay, which is okay. So the cardiovascular system is mobilizing oxygen and carbon dioxide around the body between the lungs and the tissues. All right, so we talked about that in the blood chapter. We talked about that in the cardiovascular chapter, where we are taking blood either oxygenated or deoxygenated, and we're cycling it through, which is basically going to go eventually through the lungs to be redone. Right, so we have the ability to get air in and out of us. We have that exchange between the blood and the alveoli, and then we have the ability to transport that oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the tissues. All right. And then we have internal respiration, where we have gas exchange between the blood and the tissues. All right. So here we have this exchange of the external respiration is this exchange between the alveoli and the blood, right? So really technically the air on the inside of the alveoli in the lungs is from the outside, the external, right? And we're taking it and it's going from the outside to the inside. Now, when we're talking about internal respiration, we're talking about gas and oxygen and carbon dioxide or whatever that is in the tissues and the blood already, and they're making an exchange there. Okay? So, the ability to get air in and out of us, the ability for gas to exchange from the lungs to the blood, for us to transport that gas around to the tissues that needs it, and then also for the exchange between the blood and the tissues to make it happen, right? So cellular respiration is the actual use of oxygen and production of carbon dioxide in the cells, all right? So the cellular respiration is where the oxygen is being used by the cell, and as a result, it is producing carbon dioxide, which is going to end up getting diffused into the blood, carried back to the lungs through the cardiovascular system, through the right side of the heart, back to the lungs, so that external respiration can be done. Okay? So we have those four events: moving air in and out, exchange between the lung and the blood, getting the gas transported to the tissues, and then the blood exchanging to the tissues the gases, and also taking carbon dioxide and taking it back up to the right side of the heart to be exhaled by pulmonary ventilation. All right, see that? Okay, good. So when we talk about ventilation, so we're talking about the first portion of it, right? So just the whole event of us being able to get air in and out of our body. Okay? So when air moves in, we're going to see our diaphragm is going to contract and it's going to go down. Okay? When we exhale, we're going to see that our diaphragm is going to go up and push that area and make that cavity smaller. Here we want to get air in, so we're going to drop that and we're going to make that bigger. Okay? The rib cage is going to expand, the lungs are going to expand. All right, we have to have the rib cage expand in order for our lungs to expand, right? If everything's going to try and get bigger here and fill up with air, this has to go lower to create space, and the ribs are going to, these intercostal muscles are going to relax, that rib cage is going to expand. Okay, now when we talk about forcing air out or exhalation, you're going to see the intercostal muscles, they're going to contract and they're going to make that smaller and they're going to squeeze that down. This is going to come up and it's going to decrease the volume of air in there, and it's going to push air out of the lungs. Okay? So, as we look at that, we can see how just the dropping of the diaphragm helps with that. So let's see. So, when singers, they talk about singers, if you've ever had voice lessons or anything, they talk about when you take a deep breath, you need to be, your stomach should get bigger, right? You're dropping your diaphragm in order to create as much space as possible to hold as much air in there as possible. Okay, we're going to wake up here soon. Okay. Now, when we get into this external respiration, we've seen this graphic before. We've seen this concept of red blood cells carrying deoxygenated blood back into the lungs. It's been through the right side of the heart, been through the bicuspid valve, been through the right ventricle, been through the pulmonary semilunar valve, through the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries. And here we are arriving into the lung, where we get into this down these small capillaries around the alveoli, and we're going to see this exchange of gases, all right, where technically in here we have oxygen, which is from the outside. And here we are. Here's where we're going to talk about, we're going to get this external respiration. We're going to get this air from the outside to the inside of our body. Okay, I mean, if you think about it, taking air into our lungs and us sucking up a big full lung full of air, that is still stuff from the outside. That has not yet entered the body. yes, it's inside the body and we have it, but yet it hasn't really gotten into the bloodstream. Okay, so external respiration. Okay, so as we see this, we're going to and then we have this respiratory gas transport, okay, which this concept doesn't really, since we've had the blood chapter and since we've had the cardiovascular chapter, this isn't hard for us to figure out, right? Right side of the heart, here we are. These deoxygenated blood goes in here. It's surrounded by these alveoli. We have that diffusion, simple exchange, this external respiration. Now we have oxygenated blood coming back in to the left side of the heart, shoots down the aorta. Now it's going down through the system. Blah, blah, blah. It's getting used by cells. Cellular respiration, where cells are using oxygen, and all of a sudden now they're creating carbon dioxide. And now we have blood is carrying carbon dioxide back up to repeat the process. That's respiratory gas transport. And then here we have the internal respiration, where we talk about we're talking about pressures here as well. Okay, so capillary tissue fluid exchange. The blood pressure equals osmotic pressure. Nutrients and waste are exchanged. So when we talk about here we have the the artery, and here we have the vein. All right, so arterial and a venule vein. Okay, so here we're carrying oxygenated, here we're carrying deoxygenated, right? So here the blood pressure is greater than the osmotic pressure, and the fluid moves into the tissues. All right, so here we have oxygenated blood where the pressure is high and it is forcing the fluid into the tissue. It's greater than the osmotic pressure. Okay? And so here at the beginning of this, when we get into this capillary tissue exchange here, then we're starting to talk about the blood pressure equals the osmotic pressure. Nutrients and wastes are exchanged. Okay? So here we have this exchange of stuff going into the body, like oxygen, like glucose, like whatever it would be. And here we have carbon dioxide and garbage and lactic acid and whatever else that has been created to be exchanged into the vessel. Okay? And here, now we switch, right? Now we have the pressure was high here, forcing stuff into, causing that exchange. Now, as we start to do this exchange and we have the waste, now we have where the osmotic pressure, the area around the vessel, is higher than the blood pressure, and fluid moves into the capillary. Okay? And then we have this where the wastes are exchanged, they are in the blood. Now, if everything's being forced into the blood vessel because the pressure is higher on the outside than the inside, and that's going to drive things back up towards the heart. So cellular respiration, we talked about some of this with aerobic and anaerobic respiration. We didn't get into a whole bunch of drawing it around. But we see here where if you take glucose, right, and you add a bunch of oxygen to it, it splits it all up into some carbon dioxide and water and energy. Okay? So when we get 6 molecules of oxygen, we're going to get out 6 of carbon dioxide. Okay, so we can see that through this process, we are going to not only use up the oxygen, the cells are going to use it up, but as they run through this process to create the ATP, it does create waste and water, right? There's their osmotic pressure. It's making water and carbon dioxide. And so when we get here and we've made carbon dioxide and water, the pressure in the tissue is going to be higher than in the vessel, and things are going to go in, and the fluid's going to go in, and it's going to carry the carbon dioxide and the waste and all the garbage. Okay? So there's your cellular respiration. Okay? So there's your 4 steps in a nutshell, right? You're going to need to know that if you're going to suck in a bunch of air, you've got to make that area bigger, right? So you're going to drop that diaphragm. You're going to relax that rib cage. Those lungs are going to expand. When you're going to expel air out, Then you're going to push that diaphragm up, make that area smaller. Your rib cage is going to contract. Most of the time when you exhale, and you're not trying to exhale, you don't have a lot of muscle stuff going on here, where you are taking your intercostal muscles and squeezing down to make your rib cage smaller. Most of the time, it is all done by this, the diaphragm. Okay, but if you're going to be like trying to blow out birthday candles, right, that are sitting, let's say 3 feet away. Now you're not only using your diaphragm, but now you're taking your rib cage, the muscles are with your rib cage, and you are causing them to take and forcibly make your rib cage smaller, which will help push, which will help increase the pressure in the lungs, and it's going to shoot air out of you. Okay, and now we're going to get into that here with the mechanics of breathing. The mechanics. Anyway. Okay. So, let me see. Do I even have anybody here? Oh, I do. Huh? Hi, everybody. Okay. So, the mechanics of breathing. So, I kind of just went through that a little bit with this here, right? So, pulmonary ventilation, right? That's the first event, right? We have to be able, external respiration, internal respiration, the transport of gases isn't going to happen if we can't get air in and out of us, right? So, we're talking, that's in air moving in and out, and it depends if you're going to inspire air. If your inspiration is moving air into the lungs, it's not just me teaching you every day and inspiring you to be a better person, right? We're talking about bringing air into your lungs. All right. So, expiration, when you're gonna push air out of you, that's moving air out of your lungs. Okay. That's vocabulary right there. Okay. So now we have intrapulmonary pressure, right? So inside the lung pressure. So pressure within the alveoli, right? All those little thin little air-like sacs, right? That's the pressure, right? It changes, the pressure inside of those little sacs change with the different times of breathing, the different phases of breathing, all right? They always equalize itself with atmospheric pressure. Okay, so the pressure of air on the outside of us, this pressure inside the lung is going to equalize itself with that. Okay? Now, intrapleural pressure, right? So now we have the pleura, right? We have the space. So the pressure within the space between the membranes, right? So the visceral and the parietal, so the space between the lung itself and the thoracic cage, that space is always 4 millimeters of mercury less than intrapulmonary pressure. All right, so let's think about this. Okay, so hold on. We have our lungs. We have the pressure is going to change as we breathe in or breathe out. But when we talk about when we're just sitting here and we're not in the act of breathing, the pressure inside of the lung and the pressure of the atmosphere, the air pressure outside of us, are equal. Okay? Now, the pressure in the space between the lung and the thoracic wall, the cavity, that space in between, is lower than the pressure inside of that. Now, why would that be important? Right? If it was the same, the lungs would have a hard time moving, expanding, and going down, right? If the pressure is the same, then that's as much pressure is putting on the outside of the lung as the inside of the lung, and that's going to make it hard for the lung to fill up and contract down and fill up. It wouldn't hurt for it to contract down so much, but it would hurt for it to expand. All right, so that pressure on the outside, the space of the cavity there is less than what's inside, right? So that helps. So if the pressure, we're trying to bring air in, and we're increasing the pressure on the inside of the lung, that space is going to allow for that to do that easily because the pressure's lower surrounding the lung. Does that make sense? Okay, it does. But you might have to listen to this a few times. Okay? So we're talking about pressure changes. The stuff inside the lung is technically, that is a avenue to the outside, and it's going to be the same as the atmospheric pressure. But the place inside the body, that is less pressure around the lung so that the lung can expand well. Okay, I think I've sufficiently beat that dead horse. And let me keep going here. Okay, so we have the intrapleural fluid. Okay, so here we have, so this is a really kind of a cracky type of whatever. So pretend this is the lung. It's a circle, but it's a lung. Okay, so the parietal pleura, right? The lining of the cavity that the lungs are sitting in. The yellow line is the visceral pleura, the membrane that is on the lung itself. And we know that from the last quiz that you all did pretty well on, this space that we have there has um, um, serous fluid in there, right? Well, what they're saying is if air pressure, which is normally out here, they're saying is 760 millimeters of mercury outside the body, it's going to be the same on the inside of the lung, on the inside of the alveoli, right? And so therefore, the the pressure in the space around that lung is 4 millimeters of mercury less, which would make that 756 millimeters of mercury. Okay? So now you can see with less pressure on the outside than the inside, that lung can move in and out. It can expand out or it can contract down. It can do what it wants to do without really having any issue because that pressure is less on the outside. Okay? Now, what happens when we mess with that pressure on the outside? Okay, so that's what this is called, right? Atelectasis. Okay? Any condition that causes intrapulmonary pressure to equal intrapleural pressure will cause the lungs to collapse. All right, so if we ever get an issue where this space here matches the same pressure that's in here, that pressure on the outside will cause that lung to collapse. That lung will not be able to expand and therefore will not be able to fill up with air, and therefore you will not be able to oxygenate your tissues or your blood, which will oxygenate your tissues, right? So this means that they lose the ability to move air since there is no more pressure difference. Okay, those lungs cannot expand and then fill up, and so you can't bring air in. And then if they're collapsed down, you're basically, if you can't bring it in, you're not gonna be able to get it out, right? Because there's really not gonna be that exchange. Okay, so any condition that causes that intrapulmonary, right? So here we go. So here we have lung fields. Okay, let's orient ourselves. We have our clavicles, right? We have our first ribs up here. We have our thoracic vertebrae here. This white thing here. Well, we can see our. Let's see, what side is this? Our heart will be right in here, right? We'll have a heart shadow in here, but this lung field on this side should be a bit bigger. Yeah, we know the right side of the lung is bigger. It has more lobes. We know the left side's smaller and has less bronchopulmonary segments, and we know the heart is over here and has the cardiac notch and whatever else. But this is quite a diminished field. And if we look here we see a lung field. Here we see a vertebrae. Here we see a rib going around here. Here we see the heart sitting up in here on this left side, and now we see the difference here. This pressure on the outside of this space is pushing in on that lung and not allowing that lung to fully expand. And they call that a collapsed lung. Okay? And there's many different things that can cause this, but one of the things is this is a pneumothorax, right? Where we get air in the interpleural space. We get air into that space that's normally supposed to be 4 millimeters of mercury less. We get air introduced into that space, and it's usually done by a trauma. All right, so like if you would crack a rib, and that rib would puncture the parietal pleura, the lining there, that can cause that air to escape. air becomes, then it becomes normalized or whatever else. If someone stabs you in the side with a knife or something like that, or you get whatever, air enters this area and it's going to cause that lung to collapse. Okay? So here we have, we have a small pneumothorax, we have just a little, like an air leak, we have a large pneumothorax, and so the treatment for that is you've got to remove the trapped air with a hose. You suck it out of there. And as this thing expands, it's a valve, right? So you have a one-way valve. Let's see, did we have a thing? We have it's like, so as this thing tries to expand and it'll take and push that air out, and the air will escape and won't be able to go back in. And eventually, once that lung fully expands again, you can pull that chest tube out. But the big thing is you got to make sure that the parietal pleura, the lining of that lung cavity, is closed off, or what's going to happen? You're going to get air sucked in there again, and it's going to collapse that lung again. Okay, so you can live with this, right? I mean, because you still have one side working. Now, you're going to feel like garbage. You're going to feel like you never can get your breath. You're going to have zero energy because you're probably not going to be able to oxygenate your blood like you should with one lung when you're used to having two lungs. Remember the amount of square footage or whatever, square yardage or whatever that the lungs did? I mean, so you cut that down by half. That's a big, big deal, especially when all of our body is needing oxygen all the time. Okay, and it's not even so much getting oxygen in; it's also getting carbon dioxide out. But anyway, all right. So that is what we would call that's what we call pneumothorax, and so that's a form of atelectasis. Now, are there other things that can cause that? Yeah, anything that would interrupt that parietal pleura would cause that lung to collapse, or any type of trauma or whatever that would break a rib and cause it to puncture, or actually have a hole from the outside to the inside that would cause that collapsed lung. How long have I been going here? I don't even know how long I've been going. Anyway, so let me see here. So that's good for today. That's what we're going to do. So do your corrections, get your stuff turned in, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. You guys have a good day. Ugh, sorry, I was tired. Man, goodness gracious.